Supreme Magus, Web Novel, Chapter 589, Necro Forge Part 1. Lith swung the orichalcum hammer in his hands to check its balance, making Solis green with envy. She yearned to put her hands on it, but as long as she kept her ability to take physical form a secret, Solis could only watch. Aside from being entirely made of orichalcum, the hammer wasn't much different from the carpenter tools with a nail slot Zekel sold in his shop. It consisted of two parts, a straight shaft to hold it and the head. The head featured the actual hammer and the claw. The design is really poor. Lith sighed. In none of the stories he had read as a kid an enchanted item seemed out of a well-mert. He was solely interested in its properties, but the mundane look of the hammer made it underwhelming even for him. With no mold at his disposal, there wasn't much Zekel could do. Since we just have to perform experiments, we'll worry about the shape for last. Solis, can you make me a blacksmith lab? Give me a moment, she replied, making the tower rumble for a few seconds. A new door appeared in the basement. Behind it, there was a perfect replica of Zekel's workshop. Lith nodded in approval and looked at his pocket watch. He had 6 hours before he had to be at Camilla's place. Okay, no time to lose. First things first, let's check out our forge. Solis took the adamant forge out of her pocket dimension, allowing both of them to appreciate the vigorous flow of world energy it induced in its surroundings. The adamant was like a magnet for world energy. No matter how good a monoconductor the adamant was, it couldn't contain an indefinite amount of energy. Once it was saturated, the constant stream of new world energy would force the old one stored inside the metal to come out, generating an artificial mana flow. It was a phenomenon very similar to invigoration, when Lith made the world energy course through his body without absorbing it. That way the world energy wouldn't nurture his mana core, but it would replenish his mana and bring his body back to its peak condition. This is interesting. What if adamant is just one of the many metals that don't exist on Earth? What if it's a metal capable of using some kind of accumulation to refine itself over the centuries until it becomes adamant? Lith wondered. He placed his hand over the forge and used invigoration on it. Just like for the orichalcum, he could see inside the block of metal as if it was a living being. To him, the forge appeared as if it was made of light, with very few impurities inside of it. The impurities were thin black veins, tainting the otherwise pristine element. He attempted to take control of the adamant's mana flow to expel the impurities, but they refused to budge even of a single millimeter. Not even Solis's power, boosted by her tower form, managed to do any better. They couldn't risk damaging it, so they put it back inside their pocket dimension and took out a new crate of orichalcum ore. I'm really curious to see if Zekel is right. Maybe with origin flames we can skip the smelting phase and obtain orichalcum faster. Solis proposed. Lith put the ore inside a crucible and made his throat turn into his hybrid form. Wait a minute, he choked on his flames and burned his own mouth. Everything in the tower is part of you. Did you make the crucible or crafted a real one? I made it. Solis's wisp shuddered. With the origin flame's power, she had been seconds away from a world of pain. After Lith made a makeshift crucible from clay with earth magic, he put it inside the furnace and breathed a small jet of origin flames. The crucible held, but Lith could see it getting thinner, forcing him to add new clay that would immediately ignite as well. Solis had to use a few rays to keep the flames in check and prevent them from attacking the furnace too. Origin flames are hungry little critters. If I'm not careful they would spread everywhere, she said. When the fire went out, the results were appalling. The clay had turned into high-quality ceramic, which was useless to them, whereas the over 10 kilograms of ore had disappeared, leaving only a few droplets of silvery metal. The good news is that's pure adamant. The bad news is that there is so little that I can't even make a ring out of it. Sure, if I sacrifice a few crates I could get an adamant ring, but to what end? I have no blueprint for powerful rings. It would only be a waste of precious material. I don't know how much orichalcum we'll need to make the improved version of the skinwalker armor. 10 kilos is already a huge hit. Lith sighed. Let's work on the hammer, then, Solis said. Their aim was to forge master a tool that would improve all of their future works. The idea was based on their studies on true forge mastering when they were still at the White Griffin Academy. Back then, Lith had been forced to use a hybrid technique using both fake and true magic to forge master his creations, but now he could rely solely on the latter to step up his game. During his research, he had devised 2 possible ways to create superior magical items with true forge mastering. The first required for him to shape the pseudo-core outside its future recipient and then merge them together before creating the necessary mana pathways to make it permanent. The second one, instead, would have him create both a small pseudo-core and thin mana pathways at once. Lith had to infuse both of them with more energy until they reached the desired size. Each method had its pros and cons, at least on paper. By creating a complete pseudo-core, Lith had all the time he wanted to shape it with surgical precision and charge it with enough energy to fuel the effects he wanted to achieve. The downside of such a method was that injecting such a big energy mass inside inanimate matter would encounter a lot of resistance and put a huge amount of stress on its recipient. If he wasn't careful, most materials would shatter due to a mana flow too strong and sudden for them to handle. To make matters worse, the pseudo-core was likely to be deformed in the process, and fixing it would require to inject even more mana, adding even more stress on the material. Only then could Lith try to create the mana pathways necessary to stabilize the pseudo-core. Too few in the mana would be dispersed, too many in the item would crumble. Creating a small pseudo-core and mana pathways at the same time, instead, would allow Lith to pile up the mana inside its recipient one bit at the time. It would give him the opportunity to not exceed the limits of the chosen material and fix any errors he might make in the early steps during the later stages. The main problem of this method was that any late mistake couldn't be fixed. Also, developing all of the mana pathways along with the pseudo-core at the same time was very demanding in terms of mana and focus. Web Novel, Chapter 590, Necro Forge Part 2. Lith had dubbed the two methods as Necroforge and Bloomforge respectively. The former followed the same pattern Lith used to create his lesser undead. Back in Xantia, his plan involved keeping a perfect blood core at the ready along with Trouble's corpse. An undead Balor was the perfect way to beat numbers with raw power. Unfortunately, powerful corpses craved for the necromantic energies of a blood core and had no need for mana pathways, whereas inanimate objects rejected magic. The latter method was derived by Lith's studies on the growth of the pseudo-cores of mana crystals and of the mana core of plants. Once again, the main difference was that inanimate objects had no core nor room for growth to begin with. Let's start with Necroforge, Lith said. With a bleeding wallet, Lith took 2 cyan mana crystals out of his pocket dimension. He couldn't use blue crystals for a mere test run, nor he could risk using weak green crystals and fail just because he was a cheapskate. He used Invigoration to fill his body with mana, then he drew several runes in the air to perform the true magic version of bonding. It was a Tier 5 Forgemaster spell that was used to fuse together mana crystals and items before enchanting the latter. Once fused with inanimate objects, mana crystals would grant them a mana circulatory system, of which they were the literal beating heart, and an innate mana flow akin to a living being. Each rune produced a mana filament as thin as a hair that would go through both the hammer and the mana crystals, bringing them closer and closer at each passage until they became one. The 3 objects started to float in mid-air, orbiting around each other like triplet stars. Lith had performed this process countless times. Each one of the magical home appliances or toys he made was fueled by mana crystals. He would consume low-quality materials, make his family happy, and gain a lot of experience. 3 birds with 1 stone. Then, it was time to create the pseudo-core with Necroforge. Even though Lith was a master at energy manipulation, shaping a complete core was something that only an awakened could do. Cores looked like spheres of energy, but they were so much more. Thanks to necromancy, Lith had learned that a blood core defined how strong the undead would be, if it would retain any memory or conscience, and even the abilities they would be born with. Creating a core, no matter if a pseudo or blood one, was akin to create a whole living being. The purpose of the hammer is to act as a temporary vessel for my mana. The problem of forge mastering is that the stronger the spell you want to infuse an item with is, the greater the amount of mana that you need to succeed. If the maximum amount of mana a forge master can handle is 100, their limit is a spell with a mana cost of 99. With this hammer, my limit might expand up to 150 while forge mastering enchanted items. It needs a simple but powerful pseudo-core with the sole purpose of storing mana. Lith thought. He shaped the pseudo-core to resemble his own, but without all the complex patterns that linked it to his body. Thanks to Invigoration, Lith could look at his own mana core anytime. Whenever he spotted a mistake or an imperfection, he needed but a thought to correct it. Next came the hard part. Even though Orichalcum seemed to accept the pseudo-core as a thirsty man yearns for spring water, even with the mana vessels creating a complex system capable of evenly distributing the incoming energy mass, Lith felt the core distorting the moment it made contact with the hammer. The Orichalcum allowed magic to circulate almost freely, but the energy signature of the crystals rejected the foreign mana the pseudo-core was made of. It was like transplanting an organ from a random donor and then beat the patient's body into submission to prevent graft rejection. Lith took things slow and easy. He made the pseudo-core slowly enter the hammer to have the time to spot and correct any deformation as soon as they formed. At the same time, he flooded the hammer's mana vessels with his own mana. It reduced the resistance the core encountered by both weakening the opposing flow and improving the affinity the Orichalcum had for Lith's mana. The process required an enormous amount of energy that only an awakened using Invigoration could afford. Once the core was at the center of the mana circulatory system, Lith created the mana pathways. With each pathway he completed, the 2 different kinds of mana started to freely flow into each other until they merged into a single entity. When the process was over, Lith was covered in sweat. I just want to take a bath and sleep. I used Invigoration so much that my entire body aches. The silver lining is that the procedure succeeded, Lith said. Well, imagine how hard it would have been without me fueling the magic circle in your stead. This is just a prototype, so I wouldn't count my chickens before they hatch. Solus said. Why so negative? Everything went smoothly and now all we have to do is to use the Orichalcum hammer to forge master something to check its performances. I suppose we could do that. You always have a lot more time when you were single, Solus said while making the pocket watch float in front of Lith. 6:30 already? Why didn't you tell me earlier? Lith blurted out. We were in the middle of a 6 hours and a half experiment. I don't think you would have gracefully thanked me if I made you lose your focus. Lith had barely the time to imprint the hammer to check if it worked, take a quick bath to wash away the stench of sweat, sulfur, and all the smelly stuff he had used at the smithy before warping for his life to get at Camilla's home. Thank my paranoia for cleaning her apartment before leaving and for storing all the dishes from our favorite restaurant in my pocket dimension before starting my experiments. Lith said to himself while he set the table and made all he could to not make it evident that he had just arrived. Even though he had used invigoration after the bath, he needed to use it again to stop panting. He was at his second breath worth of energy when he heard the key turning and the door opened. 7 sharp. Camilla really is a military woman. I never thought the day would come where I would wish for my girlfriend not to be on time. Lith thought. Camilla looked at the dim lights and the steaming food on the table with a radiant smile. She put her military cap on the coat hanger in the hallway before asking to Lith. You are here, so you kept at least half of your promise. Did you risk your life today? He thought about it for a couple of seconds before answering. No, worst case scenario I would have wasted a lot of money and materials. Then you kept your promise and made my day. Camilla put her arms around his neck before giving him a passionate kiss.